Hello, friends. Welcome to today's session. We are building upon the last session. We talked about cost classifications. In this very study, we are going to ask, how do we absorb or how do we infuse any indirect cost into our total product cost? So that's what we are going to look in this particular session. Okay, so in the meanwhile, we have all understood how to easily plug in direct cost or direct material cost into our cost of item or cost of product. What about the indirect cost? So there are costing techniques which we can use in order to get an ideal allocation system, in order to get the precise amount of these overheads, these indirect costs, which should be included into the product cost. So a quick recap on the cost classifications. We remembered cost could be grouped into either production or non-production or period cost, okay? And then the production costs are classed into direct and indirect. Most of the non-production costs are indirect. And then at the end of the day, once we have sold our products, it moves back into the income statement, to the period time scale, okay? So again, costs move or they behave in relation to how the activity levels also change. We had quite a number of examples to use in terms of cost classifications and then behaviors, right? Now let's delve deep into this allocation or assignment of cost. The direct costs are easy. We can easily trace them. And of course, we can simply add them to get the product cost. But the indirect cost, like I said, we need to have an appropriate allocation system which will help us absorb these indirect costs into the product cost. Let's take an example of a business which makes chairs. Wood, paint, these are direct costs. So we can easily plug them into the cost of the product, of the chair. Labor hours is also variable, directly related to the production of the chairs. But what about the rents and rates? What about the electricity? These are indirect costs, and we need to use an appropriate system to allocate these costs into the product cost, into the cost of the chair. Now, the question is that if we have these direct costs, which we can easily work out, which method should we use to be able to get the indirect cost properly allocated? It is very easy when we have a single line of business. Look at, for example, let's say the company does only chairs or produces only chairs, nothing more. If that's the case, it's quite easy to allocate the cost or the indirect cost into to find the cost, the indirect cost per unit. Let's assume that we produced 500 chairs annually. It's easy. If annually rent and rate is 5,000, we divide the 5,000 pounds by the 500 chairs to get 10 pounds per chair, which we will allocate to rents and what? And rates. The same applies to electricity. If electricity at the end of the year is 1,200 and we produce 500 chairs, then we allocate the 500 against the 1,200 to get 2.4 pounds per chair. Easy. So in this case, when we want to find the total product cost, we add the direct materials, the labor, and then the direct materials, the labor, and the materials is made up of the wood and the paint. Okay, these are all direct costs. Labor is also a direct cost. And then we add the share of the indirect cost, which is the rent and rate, and then the electricity, which we found. Quite easy to work it out. Okay, so let's take a quick example. So assuming a single line of business, we produce chairs or any material. Let's talk about chairs as an example. So the product requires material of 10. Total material cost is 10, direct cost, labor 5. The indirect overheads are 8,000 and output produced annually is 4,000. So to get the indirect cost per unit, we just divide the 8,000 by the 4,000. So we get 2, right? Quite easy. So add your 10 to the 5 to the 2, and you get 17. Straightforward, right? I will leave you to brood over the next question. Which of the following statements are false regarding product cost based on our last slide or last lecture? Now let's go on and see the methods which we use to absorb cost. In the scenario where we do not produce only one line of activity or product, but we produce more. So if we have a company, for example, which produces more than one type of an item, how do we allocate these items? If it is a single line, like we said, it's quite easy. But if it is different, how do we do it? There's a two-stage allocation process. And one of the methods in allocating this indirect cost to product is called absorption costing. Okay, there are other methods like activity-based costing. We'll look at it very soon, but let's take it one step at a time. So we have an absorption costing, and like the name sounds, we absorb these indirect costs after we've gone through some slight mechanics and allocate it to the cost of the product. Two-stage approach is used. So first, all the indirect cost information is collected, and these are then split or assigned to the production department, to the various departments that contribute to the production of the item, of the product. Then we determine an appropriate absorption rate, which we'll calculate based on amount of time we use to make the product, right? Now let's take, in a typical traditional costing system, we have the first stage. We know the overall overhead cost, assign them to the various cost centers, okay? After which we can then move on and then look at how to deal with the next stage. Now, take a simple example where we produce two types of guitars, okay? The Flying Z and the Bellycaster. The unit produced annually is 200 and 100. The material or the labor cost, the material and labor cost, these are direct costs, are 50 and 80, and then 40 and 60 respectively for the two. You can see it on the screen. Now the hours worked for the particular unit where we produce more, Flying Z produced 200, it makes sense that more hours are spent there, 10, and Bellycaster 100 annually. So they use 8 hours per unit. Machine hours again, 3 and 2. These are easy to allocate. We have direct costs, so we can easily attribute them. But what about the indirect component? Workshop supervisor, electricity, rent and rate for the two different lines of products. So this one is not one line of product, two. Therefore, we need to do a little calculation, not so complex, okay? Not so complex, very easy. Let's look at it. So for all the direct, easy, allocate them, right? What about the indirect? That's where the problem comes in. So we would assume that workshop supervisor, the basis upon which he's paid is the number of people he supervises. Electricity, based on the machines we use in producing these products. So let's say machine is the basis, and then rent and rate is the floor square per meter, which consumes the electricity. These bases you are seeing over there is what we term the cost drivers. What drives the cost? Okay, what drives the supervisor's cost is the number of employees he supervises. So department 1, let's say it is the carpentry department, and department 2 is the painting department. All right, you can see from the information up there. So the supervisor supervises 6 people in total. If you want to allocate the cost, the total supervisor's cost to department 1, find simple ratio and proportion. So 4 divided by 6 times the 18,000 gives us the 12,000, as you can see on the screen for department 1. Same applies to department 2. So 2 over 6 times the 18,000 gives us the 6,000. So do the same for electricity based on machines used. Total machines used are 8. So for the department 1 is 5 divided by 8 times 8,000. Department 2 is 3 divided by 8 over 8,000. Rent and rate per square meter. Do simple ratio and proportion. And then you add them up. So department 1, the total indirect cost that could be allocated is 21,000. Whereas department 2, the total indirect cost that could be allocated is 11,000. Now let us now drill down and see how we can absorb these per unit into each product. Okay. So for the first item, we are assuming, so let's go to the next stage of this absorption process. Okay. So for the next step that we are going to look, direct labor hours, we are assuming that department 1, which is the carpentry department, tell me what drives them most over here. What would they be doing more over there? It's labor hours. Carpentry is manpower. So labor hours, right? The painting department, what would we use more? Machine. So we can say that the basis upon which we will allocate or we can absorb these should be the labor hours for carpentry and then machine hours for painting, right? So we move on, and then we do the computation. So in the first instance, we are picking, let's say, for each total hours we want to get for the entire production process, right? The first machine, the first product which we produce 200 units. We want to find the total labor hours. They spend 10 hours per unit. The second unit, 100 units. They spent 8 hours per unit. So the first machine that we find, the first Flying Z, used 200 units produced, and you actually used 10, as you can see from the information. Belly caster, 100 units, used 60. Okay, so we want to find the total labor hours. So multiply the units by the labor hours and add them, sum them up. So we get 2,800. Same for the machine hours. Belly caster was 100, and then Flying Z was 200 units. Multiply them by the machine hours and total them, sum them up. We get 800. Okay. So in absorbing, the absorption rate for the carpentry department, which is labor intensive, we use the labor hours. Okay. Remember, we had how much for the department one? 21,000. So the 21,000 divided by the total manpower, labor hours, will give us the cost we need to allocate per unit of a product. So divide the entire 21,000, which we computed here, which includes the supervisor's cost over there. And it is not surprising, most supervisors will be paid based on labor hours, right? So it is the total we found over there, the 21,000 divided by the 2,800 total labor hours will give us a 7.5 per hour to be absorbed. Okay, and then the next one for the department 2, the finishing department, machine intensive. Usually you should find this information in the question that will tell you this one is more driven by labor hours and this department is more driven by machine hours. You should simply find it. Even if you don't find it, you can use simple logical reasoning and you can tell. We'll look at another example where we have this particular scenario in. So for the absorption rate for the finishing department, it is the total 11,000 cost by the 800. So we get 13.7 pounds per hour. Now, let's plug in and find the total unit cost of an item. Very easy to plug in the direct cost, right? The material, the labor, which was found, which was already given in the information. What about the overheads? What about the overheads? So in the first instance, the carpentry department, the overheads, remember it was 7.5 per what? Per hour, 7.5 per hour. So if you go back to the information which was given, we multiplied by the labor hours we have there, 10. 10, okay. So 7.5 by the 10 gives us 75 for the Flying Z. For the painting or finishing of the Flying Z, what was the cost per unit, which we absorbed? 13.5. And they used what? Machine hours, right? Machine hours. So what was the machine hours you found over there? 3. Okay, so we multiply our 13.5 by the 3 to give us 41. Do the same for belly caster. After which you then sum everything up. So you get the total product cost for Flying Z being the total direct cost, which is 50 plus 80, plus the overheads, which we have absorbed based on the absorption rate, which we identified. Okay, so quite easy to find the direct cost, but absorption rate depending on which normally drives or which causes us to use more of which element, the driver. Okay, labor hours or labor intensive for carpentry, and then machine intensive for the finishing or for the painting. Okay, so this gives us how we can absorb indirect cost into the cost of the product, get a final finished product. Let's take another example. So we have depreciation for a product, okay? Security cost, electricity, and supervisor. Look at the basis, the drivers. The question is, which one would you allocate to which cost above? Number of employees, I will give it to supervisor. Quite easy, straight to find it. Kilowatts of power used will go to electricity, right? Floor space, floor area per square meter. Let's hang on quietly. Let's go to the next one. Book value of machinery, there's machine depreciation. So I'll simply allocate book value to machine depreciation. And then floor area for security cost. If we have CCTVs and we have a very large square area, you should expect more CCTVs to cover those larger areas. If you have one person who is monitoring about 10 areas, then you should know for sure that we will require more security personnel to cover more areas, right? So we'll just allocate these. So these are the ones that will help us to identify the cost, okay, to get the specific unit cost for each of them. So for department 1, what is the total number of personnel that the supervisor supervises? 6 plus 4 is 10. So do simple ratio and proportion. For department 1, it is 6 divided by what? 10 times the 18,000. Do the same for the kilowatts. Add the 50 to the 25,000, 75, and then use simple ratio and proportion. 50 divided by 75,000, or 50,000 divided by 75,000 times the electricity cost of 19,000, right? The same applies to the floor space. Book value 80 plus 120, 200,000. So if you want to find for department 2, it is 120,000 divided by the 200,000 total book value, okay, divided by the depreciation of 10,000, right? So this is what I've just explained in the earlier slide. So you get these total items gotten over there, and then you can get the share for each department, add them up, and you should, when you add the 25,300 to the 17,700, you should get the total cost of what we are finding here. Always it must jive, always it must jive, right? So that's it for this. We'll look at the next section in a bit. So just take keynote of how to absorb indirect cost into the product cost using an absorption costing method. As I said, we have other methods, ABC activity based. We also have marginal. Don't worry. In the next slide, you'll see it there. Okay. Thank you and see you soon.